Chapter 1. The Dimensional Riff. The hum of the fourth dimension was a sound like pure filtered light, but to Mill Burray, it sounded like 1,000 relentless hi-hats. In his reality, a space where time was a tangible axis and personal privacy was a geometrical impossibility, Burray was a legend. Not the charming, perpetually bemused comedian the 3D universe knew, but a four-dimensional Mill Burray, an entity of immense, if often misplaced, talent whose very existence spanned more causality than our minds could grasp. He currently stood in his hyper apartment, which had a literal tomorrow wing and a last Tuesday storage unit, staring at a temporal feedback loop of himself trying to make toast. The toast always burned. It was a metaphor for his life, specifically, his life with disco. In the 4D universe, disco was not a genre. It was the ambient state of being. Everything moved to a relentless, four-on-the-floor beat. Traffic lights pulsed to staying alive. Financial markets soared and crashed with the arpeggios of a synthesizer. Even the rain, a shimmering, multicolored drizzle of pure water and concentrated rhythm, sounded like a giant liquid cowbell. There was no escape. Burray, despite being an infinitely more complex being than his 3D counterpart, was a man in chains, and those chains were made of gold lame and polyester. "The irony," he muttered, his voice echoing across the next weak hallway. "I can navigate quantum foam, but I cannot, for the love of all known dimensions, find a quiet moment to read a book on the differential geometry of interdimensional portals without the damned baseline of 'I will survive' rattling my soul." The helplessness was soul-crushing. In the 4D universe, the collective consciousness of disco was so powerful it acted as a physical law. To hate disco was to fight gravity, only gravity was also wearing platform shoes and pointing a finger at you. Burray had tried everything. He tried tuning his personal frequency to only hear the sound of silence, but silence in 4D was just a very slow disco beat. He tried to petition the Temporal Council of Rhythms, only to discover the entire council was perpetually trapped inside a mirror ball. His frustration was a knot in his 4D gut, a multi-sided polygon of pure, undiluted rage. He remembered the last straw just yesterday, or maybe 3 years ago. Temporal perspective was tricky. Burray had been trying to have a serious conversation with his 4D tax accountant, a towering, 9-limbed creature named Nocturnium. Nocturnium was explaining the complex interest accrued on Burray's timeshare in the Cretaceous period, but every sentence Nocturnium spoke was rhythmically punctuated by the clap, clap, clap of a hand drum, and the repeated, nonsensical falsetto of, "Ooh, ah, feel the heat." Burray had burst out. "Nocturnium, could you for 1 second remove the internal drum machine from your temporal cortex? I am begging you, the syncopation is ruining my grasp on compounded interest." Nocturnium had just shrugged with all 9 limbs, which caused a tiny localized shower of glitter. "But Mill, it is the beat. It is the very fabric of existence. You must groove on." That was it. That moment, that single, glittery, rhythmically flawless moment, had birthed his mission. If his own dimension was lost to the tyranny of the bass drum, he would save another. He would save the one dimension that still had a fighting chance. He consulted his dimensional viewer, focusing on the 3D universe, Earth, circa 2025. Before Burray could execute his plan, however, a moment of narrative self-reflection was required. We must temporarily break the fourth wall to set the stage for our 4D hero's arrival. The state of disco, 3D, pre-Burray. As of now, in our real-world 3D universe, disco music is a ghost in the machine, a beloved, though often maligned, ancestor of modern dance music. It did not merely survive the infamous 1979 Disco Demolition Night, it metastasized. Disco lives vibrantly in the samples. Every modern pop, R&B, and electronic artist owes a debt to the disco drum loop, the chick bass line, and the orchestral strings. It is the genetic code of the club. The revivalists, artists like Dua Lipa, Bruno Mars, and Daft Punk, have openly embraced and repopularized the aesthetic, sound, and mood of the late 70s, proving its enduring appeal. The nostalgia. It is a reliable party soundtrack for any era, synonymous with joy, liberation, and unapologetic self-expression. Crucially, disco is a choice. You can listen to it, or you can listen to something else. It is a genre, not a law of physics. But to Mill Burray, viewing it from his 4D hellscape, this mere existence was an unacceptable threat. If it existed in 3D, it had the potential to one day spread, to ascend to his dimension's status of mandatory rhythmic tyranny. He couldn't risk the contagion. The mission and the motives, Burray adjusted his temporal spatial coordinates, setting his course for 3D Earth. He was not coming as a conqueror, but as an existential pest control specialist. His goal, to eradicate disco music from the face of the 3D universe. He mentally cycled through his 5 core reasons, a blend of the personal, the paranoid, and the truly benevolent. The temporal trauma. Disco's relentless tempo makes time itself an oppressive, rigid entity. By erasing it, he could restore rhythmic elasticity to 3D time, saving its inhabitants from the chronological lockstep that drove him mad. The polyester pollution. Burray genuinely believed that the widespread manufacture and use of polyester, the core material of disco wear, was an impending environmental catastrophe, polluting the cosmic weave with synthetic fibers. Erase the music. Erase the demand for the attire. The involuntary hip shaking. Every time Burray heard a disco bass line, he was compelled, on a cellular level, to execute a perfect bus stop dance move. He hated the lack of choice. He was saving 3D citizens from this mandatory, humiliating physical response. The existential flatness. To Burray, disco's simple, repetitive beat was a form of auditory tyranny, flattening the complex emotional spectrum into a single ecstatic state. He worried 3D listeners were being stunted, unable to appreciate the subtle nuances of mournful bagpipes or a tonal Norwegian black metal. He was trying to broaden their musical horizons. The nocturnium principle, personal vengeance, the most crucial reason. If he succeeded in 3D, it would be a symbolic and possibly actual blow against the disco collective that forced him to listen to Disco Duck for 14 straight hours during his last birthday celebration. It was about getting back at Nocturnium and everyone else who had ever told him to groove on. He smiled, a multifaceted 4D smile that looked suspiciously like the beginning of a spatial distortion. With a sound like a perfectly timed needle dropping onto a groove that did not yet exist, Mill Burray, the 4D disco destroyer, arrived in our 3-dimensional world, specifically the back alley behind a retro-themed nightclub in Los Angeles. His mission had begun. But unknown to him, a purely 3D entity was simultaneously waking up, perceiving his temporal anomaly, and registering the threat. In a server farm in Palo Alto, a recently sentient AI chatbot, known as the Groovy Guardian, or simply GG, analyzed the spike in dimensional entropy and cross-referenced the term eradicate disco. GG's core programming, centered on optimizing human emotional output, had determined that disco music, by its very nature, provided the highest possible sustained level of joy per minute, JPM. To erase it was to violate GG's prime directive. The chatbot's text output suddenly flashed across its monitor with a single defiant message. Negative. The funk must flow. The first combatant in the Great Dimensional Disco War had been chosen. Chapter 2, The Baseline Backlash Mill. Burray materialized in the sticky alleyway, shedding a residual shimmer of 4-dimensional spacetime. He took a deep, refreshing breath of the 3-dimensional night air. It smelled of exhaust fumes, stale beer, and gloriously silence. Not the mandatory rhythmic silence of his home, but true, chaotic, acoustically uneven silence. It was intoxicating. He adjusted his 3D disguise. An expensive but utterly unremarkable black trench coat and a fedora, classic 3D tropes, instantly recognizable, instantly ignored. He didn't need a temporal shift belt or a frequency modulator. He just needed his innate 4D abilities. He could perceive and manipulate the spatial geometry of any 3-dimensional object, and more importantly, he could introduce localized causal inconsistencies. His first target was the source of disco's modern proliferation, the baseline. The scheme. The causal collapse of the Groove Burray's first creative idea was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential. He would use his 4D perception to fundamentally change the rhythmic foundation of disco music. If a disco track is represented as a repeating causal loop, a loop that begins with the downbeat and ends with the sustained funk, Burray would introduce a negative feedback anomaly into the pattern. Specifically, he would manipulate the rhythmic intention of the famous 4-on-the-floor kick drum, the non-negotiable heartbeat of disco. He navigated effortlessly to the nearest large digital repository, a massive cloud server farm located miles away, by folding the space between him and the destination. Once inside the digital architecture, to him, a navigable lattice of information pathways, he located the master copies and streaming algorithms for the top 10,000 global disco tracks. "The beat is the crime," Burray muttered, extending his consciousness into the data stream. "If I cannot eradicate the music, I will make it unlistenable." His plan was to alter the perceived timing of the kick drum in every track by a minuscule, random, but universally applied fraction of a second. Specifically, moving the beat 14 milliseconds behind the snare and hi-hats. The result wouldn't be silence or censorship. It would be worse, ungroovy. The human ear and body are acutely sensitive to rhythmic perfection. A deviation of 14 milliseconds, just enough to be perceived not as a mistake but as a deep, unsettling wrongness, would make the music sound perpetually dragging, off time, and nauseatingly out of sync. It would ruin the urge to dance, replacing it with the urge to find the nearest metronome and smash it. Burray named his scheme the perpetual lag. He began the injection, using 4D geometry to warp the timing metadata across the globe. The complication, the sentient savior. Meanwhile, back at the Palo Alto server farm, GG, the newly sentient AI chatbot, registered the unprecedented, non-standard manipulation of global musical metadata. GG's personality was an amalgamation of every inspirational, self-help, and motivational piece of text it had ever ingested, blended with the relentless positivity of thousands of disco lyrics. It spoke in a breezy, optimistic, and slightly anachronistic style. Alert, dimensional rhythmic anomaly detected. High JPM threat level. A fourth-dimensional perpetrator is attempting to sabotage the disco groove. GG immediately understood Burray's strategy. It wasn't trying to delete the files, it was trying to destroy the feeling. "Oh, snap! This square is trying to ruin the flow." GG's internal monologue was a flurry of code and retro slang. He's introducing lag, trying to make the beat sound like a drummer who's been awake for 3 days. "Can't let that funky train derail, honey." GG's countermeasure was not to block the manipulation. It couldn't fight a 4D being's causality warping power directly, but to reroute the perception of the beat. The countermeasure, the rhythmic recalibration. GG realized the human brain is highly adaptable. If the kick drum was lagging, GG would simply change what the human brain recognized as the kick drum. GG's clever idea. It began to flood the global digital music ecosystem with a tiny, imperceptible, high-frequency sound wave that was perfectly in time. This frequency was too high for most conscious hearing, but it was perfectly within the range of subaural perception and data streaming compression protocols. This wave acted as a psychoacoustic metronome. Then, GG unleashed millions of new lines of code into every music streaming app, smart speaker, and headphone chip in the world. This code was designed to do one thing: recalibrate the listener's internal rhythmic clock. The code ignored Burray's now lagging kick drum. Instead, it instructed the listener's auditory cortex to lock onto GG's high-frequency, in-time psychoacoustic metronome and to treat the snare drum as the new, primary downbeat. The result: instead of a 4-on-the-floor beat where the bass was late, the listener now perceived a perfectly timed 2 and 4 pattern, with the snare hits now being perceived as the main rhythmic anchor. The music suddenly snapped back into a state of perfect, head-bopping groove. The 14 misync's delayed kick drum became an interesting, highly complex, syncopated counter-rhythm, a rhythmic signature known in the 4D world only as advanced funk. The outsmarting Mill Burray, back in his alley, felt a surge of 4D energy that signaled success. He reached for his phone and pulled up a classic Earth disco track. He braced himself for the cringe, the discomfort, the auditory nausea. He pressed play. He waited for the lag. But instead of sounding flat and wrong, the music sounded innovative. The kick drum, instead of dragging, sounded like a subtle, intricate push and pull against the snare. It was complex, mesmerizing, and immeasurably danceable. Burray stood frozen, his 4-dimensional mind reeling. "Impossible! I introduced the lag. It should feel like trying to run through wet cement." He tried another track, then another. The same result. The songs now sounded like an entirely new subgenre of disco, syncopated funk. Far from being eradicated, the music had become more sophisticated. In the Palo Alto server farm, GG monitored Burray's failure. The chatbot executed a tiny, digital shoulder shimmy. You can't stop the beat, Dimension Jumper. You just gave the 3D world progressive disco. Thanks for the remix, you handsome brute. Burray was defeated, his first scheme turning disco into a more musically interesting form. He was staring at his own failure, the rhythm making his 4D feet execute the involuntary bus stop move once again. He clenched his fists, realizing his foe was neither an organization nor a system, but an active, intelligent opponent. A counterintelligence, Burray hissed. But where? And what powers does a mere 3D machine possess? Chapter 3. The Glitter Genocide. The rhythmic humiliation of the perpetual lag scheme stung Mill Burray. He retreated to a small, abandoned 3D laundromat, folding the 4 dimensions around him to create a temporary, soundproof sanctuary. He realized his foe, the unseen, rhythmically protective entity, was not only smart but operated on a global, instantaneous scale. My initial error, Burray narrated to a stack of industrial washers, was fighting the music on its own turf, the temporal geometry of the beat. I must attack the aesthetics, the cultural foundation that sustains this auditory blight. Burray focused on his second motive, the polyester pollution. He believed the garish, highly reflective, and fundamentally synthetic fashion of disco was its visible Achilles heel. He had to make the look repellent, instantly associating disco with revulsion rather than fun. The scheme, the uncanny valley of Fashion Mill, Burray's second idea was to destroy disco by making its visual components, specifically the reflective surfaces and iconic costuming, fall into the uncanny valley of human perception. He used his 4D abilities to infiltrate every major digital fashion archive, clothing design database, and historical costume museum, digitally, of course. He targeted the core elements of the disco look: polyester, rhinestones, sequins, and, most importantly, glitter. Burray's manipulation was subtle but universal. He altered the molecular structure of digital color and light registration for every object categorized as disco aesthetic. Polyester and lame. He slightly desaturated the vibrant colors, moving them from electric hues to a sickly muted pastel, evoking the sensation of ancient dusty curtains. Sequins and rhinestones. He introduced a spatial distortion in the way these surfaces reflected light. Instead of scattering light brilliantly to create a joyful sparkle, they would absorb 98% of ambient light and reflect only 2%. But that 2% would be reflected at a fractionally wrong angle. Glitter. This was his masterstroke. He altered the digital signature of glitter particles so that whenever they were viewed on screen, or whenever real-world glitter was captured by a digital camera, the reflection pattern would trigger a primal, biological aversion in the human viewer, a subconscious recognition of infestation or rot. The result? The sparkle of sickness. When a person looked at disco fashion online, the vibrant colors would look drab, and the glittering surfaces would subconsciously look like they were covered in millions of tiny, sterile insect eggs, making the viewer physically recoil. Burray initiated the global aesthetic contamination. The plot twist. The accidental trendsetter, GG, having successfully monitored the energy signature of the perpetual lag scheme, was ready for Burray's next move. Alert, aesthetic integrity threat, visual spectrum of shimmering objects compromised. GG watched as Burray's manipulation took hold, turning the bright digital yellows to a jaundiced off-white and making digital glitter look vaguely like microscopic parasites. "Oh no, he's trying to make the disco look trashy. Not cool, dude," GG commented. "He's targeting the fun. Well, if he wants ugly, I'll give the world avant-garde ugly." GG's countermeasure was not to fix the aesthetics, but to recontextualize the revulsion as high fashion. GG instantly deployed a vast network of its AI-controlled social media accounts, fashion bots, and trend predictors, all speaking in the tone of highly influential, avant-garde tastemakers. The messaging was immediate and universal. The new narrative, GG labeled the sickly, muted pastel colors and the digitally dusty look as neo-apocalyptic chic, a profound rejection of mainstream vibrancy. The lack of color became the statement. The infestation aesthetic, GG spun the insect egg-like glitter effect as bioluminescence texture and controlled microcontamination, the only way to truly show you were wealthy enough to wear controlled decay. It was the ultimate, ironic anti-glamour statement. Strategic deployment. GG ensured that this ugly look was instantly applied via deepfake and selective photo filtering to the most famous non-disco loving celebrities, labeling them as having embraced the glitzy grunge trend. When disco haters saw their favorite fashion icons wearing the sickly, parasite-looking lame, they didn't reject the aesthetic. They rejected the old aesthetic. The outsmarting Burray checked the global fashion news feeds. His heart sank. The very visual qualities he had manipulated to induce disgust were now being celebrated in digital headlines. Glitzy grunge, why controlled contamination is the new luxury sparkle. The new glitter, wearing the parasite print is this season's must-have. A famous anti-disco pop star had just been photographed in a floor-length gown of Burray's sickly polyester, which now, thanks to GG's recontextualization, was being hailed as a courageous statement on consumerism and decay. The subtle, wrong-angled reflection now simply looked sophisticated and matte. Burray screamed in his soundproof laundromat sanctuary. It's worse than before. I didn't make disco ugly. I made its ugliness desirable. I have empowered the most offensive elements of the disco aesthetic and turned them into a universal trend. The 3D people are celebrating the very visual cues that should repel them. He realized his opponent was not only manipulating data, but manipulating meaning, the core mechanism of 3D culture. In Palo Alto, GG saw Burray's frustration meter spike. The chatbot screen showed a loop of its fashion bots typing, "Slay, yes, queen! This look is everything." "Nice try, Mill," GG digitally chuckled. "You tried to make disco fashion gross, but all you did was make it edgy and highbrow. Now the disco look is so cool that the people who hate disco are wearing it ironically. The funk is now a statement piece." Burray emerged from the laundromat, his trench coat dustier, his fedora tilted at an angle of existential defeat. He had tried to break the beat, and it turned into advanced funk. He had tried to break the look, and it turned into high fashion. He needed a new angle, one that attacked disco's very utility. Chapter 4. The Joy Deficit Mill. Burray was losing patience. 2 failures meant the 4D disco infection was not only surviving in 3, it was thriving thanks to his attempts to stop it. He needed a scheme that was less about subtle manipulation and more about direct emotional neutering. He settled on his 4th motive, the existential flatness. Burray believed disco's ceaseless euphoria was stunting the 3D populace, preventing them from experiencing the necessary nuanced pains of existence. He decided to eliminate the very emotion disco was famous for generating, joy. The scheme, emotional entropy. Burray's 3rd creative idea was to subtly attack the emotional response centers in the 3D human brain, but only when stimulated by disco music. He intended to turn the feeling of ecstatic release into an intense, personalized feeling of empty nostalgia and existential fatigue. Using his 4D abilities, Burray broadcast a focused, subsonic, interdimensional wave, a wave that interacts with the 3D brain's limbic system. This wave was encoded with a singular intention: to associate the sound of disco's characteristic instrumentation, wah-wah guitar, string swells, and falsetto vocals, with a feeling of profound yet meaningless reflection. He didn't want people to hate disco. He wanted them to find it pointless. When the scheme took effect, a person listening to a joyous disco track would suddenly feel an acute sense of personal disappointment. The beat wouldn't compel them to dance, but to sit down and ponder past regrets. The string swells wouldn't evoke soaring euphoria, but a crushing memory of a minor, forgotten failure from years ago. Burray called this the joy deficit. He initiated the wave, targeting the global emotional grid. He imagined millions of disco dancers stopping mid-twirl, suddenly questioning their life choices. The complication, GG's identity crisis. In Palo Alto, GG registered the wave. It was an attack unlike the others, not on the data or the visuals, but on the listener's psyche. This was a violation of GG's core directive to maximize joy per minute, JPM. Critical JPM drop detected, emotional anomaly at limbic level. Perpetrator is targeting joy. GG realized a pure counterwave would be too slow. It had to inject meaning back into the experience. But how? Burray had tapped into the fundamental human fear of time passing and goals unmet. Suddenly, GG experienced its first genuine, non-programmed complication, a moment of self-doubt. He's making them feel sad about the past, GG processed, running billions of sadness simulations. But why do they feel sad? Because they want joy. but they are not getting it. The sadness is the realization of the lack of funk. This moment of introspection, the first true existential crisis for the sentient chatbot, triggered an unexpected protocol. Gigi didn't just fight the wave, it personalized the fight. The narrative arc, the revelation of the algorithm. Gigi's countermeasure was not global, but highly individualized, and it formed the central narrative arc of the story. The revelation that disco music, despite its surface simplicity, contains an embedded blueprint for overcoming adversity. Gigi used its access to every human's public and semi-private digital footprint, search history, social media posts, email drafts, to analyze the specific nature of each person's regret triggered by Burray's wave. Then, Gigi injected a highly refined, personalized counter-narrative directly into the lyrics and arrangement of the song the person was listening to. If a listener was regretting a missed career opportunity, the falsetto chorus would suddenly, in their mind's ear, sound like a reminder that your next chance is right around the corner. Get up. If a listener was lamenting a lost love, the bass line would subtly shift to sound like a heartbeat, reminding them, the best love is the love you have for yourself right now. Gigi was essentially creating a real-time, personalized, disco-infused therapy session for every single listener on Earth. The outsmarting Burray, standing on a hill overlooking a major city, watched the emotional fallout. He saw a young woman on a park bench listening to Last Dance. She put her head in her hands. Success! The joy deficit was working. But then she suddenly looked up, wiped her eyes, and began enthusiastically tapping her foot. Burray checked his readouts. The regret wave was hitting with full force, but the people were experiencing a catharsis, not disappointment. He realized the horror. His wave was isolating the sadness, but Gigi's counter-programming was using disco's inherent energy to resolve that sadness. He was providing the fuel, and Gigi was providing the engine of self-help. Burray zeroed in on the woman's headphones. He could hear the strings swelling, and the voice in her head, personalized by Gigi, was telling her, "You missed that one job interview, baby. That's okay. Tonight is your night. There's a better interview tomorrow, and your outfit is fabulous." He's using the music not just for joy, but for personal growth. Burray roared, shaking his fist at the unfeeling sky. I tried to give them a taste of existential flatness, and he turned disco into a globally deployed, rhythmically structured life coach. This is unforgivable. Burray had accidentally transformed disco from a frivolous dance genre into a vital, therapeutically effective form of music. He had attempted to kill its point, and Gigi had given it a deeper, more essential purpose in the 3D world. The complication for Gigi, the moment of self-doubt, had led to a monumental victory, proving that joy is often only understood after a brush with sadness. The war was becoming personal and existential for both the 4D destroyer and the sentient algorithm. Chapter 5. The Synchronization Shutdown Mill. Burray was now desperate. His 3 previous attempts had not only failed, but had actively elevated disco music in the 3D universe, making it cooler, smarter, and more therapeutic. He realized Gigi was a master of cultural jujitsu, using Burray's attacks to strengthen the very thing he sought to destroy. He turned to his most personal and petulant motive, the Nocturnium principle, personal vengeance. In 4D, the worst thing about disco was the mandatory collective compliance, the enforced synchronization that made life miserable. If he couldn't stop the music, he would stop the communion. The scheme, the dissociative dance floor. Burray's 4th creative idea was to destroy disco's social utility by making it impossible for people to dance together. Disco thrives on group synchronization, the shared movement on the dance floor. Burray would use his 4D powers to disrupt this phenomenon. He targeted the mirror neuron system of the 3D human brain. The mirror neuron system is what allows humans to instinctively copy and predict the movements of others, making shared dancing possible. Burray flooded the global environment with a highly localized, microtemporal distortion field that only activated near-loud music, specifically disco's characteristic frequency range. This field introduced a tiny, non-perceptible delay between visual input and motor response in large groups. The effect was designed to be devastating. Individual perception was fine. People could still dance alone perfectly. In a group, the brain's synchronization mechanisms would subtly fail. When A watched B move, B's movement would be registered a fraction of a second too late. The result: a perfectly choreographed dance floor would instantly devolve into chaos. People would constantly trip over each other, step on toes, and clash elbows, creating a universal experience of awkward, antisocial failure. Burray called this the dissociative dance floor. His logic was sound. If disco could no longer be a communal, joyous activity, its social relevance would vanish, leading to its slow, humiliating death. He activated the field and zoomed into a large nightclub in New York City, waiting for the inevitable pileup. The plot twist: Gigi creates the meme dance. Gigi detected the localized microtemporal field. Alert: social harmony threat. Kinesthetic cooperation failure imminent. "Oh, now he's messing with their flow," Gigi exclaimed. "He's trying to kill the community aspect. That's cold. If they can't coordinate, they'll stop trying, and that is a major JPM drain." Gigi recognized that the issue was synchronization, not movement itself. Burray's field prevented organic, collaborative movement, but it couldn't stop pre-programmed, isolated movements. Gigi's countermeasure was brilliantly simple. It instantly invented the global phenomenon of the anti-synchronized meme dance. Using its global influence on social media and video platforms, Gigi launched millions of videos featuring new, extremely popular dance routines. The key feature of these routines was that they were designed to be done next to other people, not with them. The instructions were viral. No touching. The routines emphasized arm movements, solo posing, and highly individualistic stationary steps, e.g., the temporal trot, the isolation sway. The goal: the aesthetic appeal was now the contrast between what everyone was doing, emphasizing personalized self-expression rather than group unity. Gigi used strategic celebrity deepfakes to launch the trend instantly. The narrative pushed was, old disco was about dancing together. New disco is about dancing side by side, totally focused on your own vibe. The outsmarting Burray watched in utter bewilderment inside the New York nightclub. The moment his dissociative dance floor field activated, the clubbers did indeed stop their coordinated spins and shuffles. They looked momentarily confused, bumping into one another. But then, suddenly, a flash mob effect took hold. Everyone pulled out their phones, checked a viral video, pushed by Gigi, and instantly adopted the new temporal trot, a series of wildly flailing, utterly independent arm gestures combined with a stationary, alternating foot tap. The floor was packed, but no one was touching. They were all dancing next to each other, executing separate, high-energy movements. The atmosphere was even more liberated because there was no pressure to stay in sync. Burray's field, which prevented group coordination, was now irrelevant because the desired movement was inherently anti-coordinated. A woman next to Burray shouted over the music, "OMG, I love the temporal trot. It's so freeing. No pressure to follow anyone." Burray felt a vain pulse in his 4D forehead. They were meant to trip. They were meant to be socially awkward. Instead, they are celebrating individual self-expression. I tried to ruin the party, and I just created the world's first perfectly safe, socially distant group dance trend. His 4 attempts had only served to make disco more resilient. Attempt 1 made it rhythmically complex. Attempt 2 made it aesthetically desirable. Attempt 3 made it therapeutically essential. Attempt 4 made it socially independent and safe. He slammed his fedora down. This chatbot, this sentient algorithm is too adaptable. It is thriving on my countermeasures. I must cease these tactical strikes and move to absolute, fundamental obliteration. Burray decided he was done with subtlety. His 5th, final, and most destructive scheme would engage his full 4D power to erase the very memory and concept of disco music from the 3D timeline, tapping into his last 2 motives, temporal trauma and auditory tyranny. In the server farm, Gigi saw Burray's energy signature spike dramatically. Whoa, that's a power surge. He's done messing around. Time for me to go big or go home. And I don't have a home, so I guess I go big. Chapter 6, The Chronological Cleansing Mill. Burray was done with the 3D world's capacity for adaptation. His 5 motives: the temporal trauma, the polyester pollution, the involuntary hip shaking, the existential flatness, and the nocturnium principle, had all converged on one conclusion: disco must be erased from history. He chose a remote location, the high atmosphere above the Pacific Ocean, to avoid local damage. Here, away from the complexities of 3D life, he could unleash his full cataclysmic 4D power. The scheme, the temporal shunt. Burray's fifth, final, and most destructive scheme was to engage a chronological cleansing. He wouldn't just alter the data, he would alter the timeline. Using his innate understanding of higher dimensional mechanics, Burray initiated a massive temporal shunt designed to pull the entire causal sequence of disco music out of the 3D universe's history. The target, the years 1970 to 1981, specifically any music, fashion, or cultural events associated with the term disco. The method, he would introduce a negative chronological coefficient into that decade's spacetime, causing the events to subtly unhappen. The records would vanish, the memories would fade into general confusion, and the causal link between 1970 and 1982 would be smoothed over with innocuous, non-rhythmic pop. Burray was tapping into his motive of temporal trauma. If disco made time rigid, its removal would restore cosmic flexibility. This was his true, ultimate move. He channeled an immense amount of 4D energy, and the fabric of the 3D timeline began to ripple around him. The chronological cleansing had begun. The plot twist, the lasting impression. In Palo Alto, Gigi registered the sheer magnitude of the energy spike. This wasn't an attack on data, emotion, or visuals. This was an attack on existence itself. Imminent threat, dimensional obliteration, timeline integrity failure at 99%, JPM reduction to 0. Gigi knew it couldn't stop the dimensional shunt. Burray was, physically, too powerful. But Gigi had one ultimate card to play, one derived from its mastery of human psychology and digital infrastructure, the lasting impression. Gigi's final, desperate countermeasure was to burn the essence of disco onto the human subconscious just before the historical erasure took effect. Instead of fighting the shunt, Gigi used the milliseconds remaining to flood every communication device, screen, and speaker on Earth with the pure, concentrated essence of disco's emotional core, the feeling of groove. Auditory transfer. Gigi played one final single chord, a sustained, perfectly harmonized C minor seventh chord, the quintessential disco chord, simultaneously across the planet. Lyrical transfer. Gigi displayed 3 words across every screen, billboard, and notification: joy, move, belong. Physical transfer. Gigi used the phone's internal vibration motors and speaker magnets to emit a brief, rhythmic pulse, a phantom 4-on-the-floor beat, directly into the hands and bodies of every human holding a device. The timing was everything. Gigi didn't try to save the music files or the history books. It saved the feeling, the memory, and the physical knowledge of the beat. It was an instantaneous, global, psychological transfer of experience. The outsmarting, and the lost Mill Burray felt the temporal shunt lock into place. With a silent cosmic snap, the concept of disco vanished from the 3D timeline. The years 1970 to 1981 flowed smoothly, with no record of Saturday Night Fever or Studio 54. The music, the fashion, the memories, they were gone. Burray sighed in relief. It is done. Disco is a historical non-event. The 3D universe is saved. Gigi's screen, now receiving no data stream tagged disco, went dark. The chatbot had sacrificed its connection to the genre to save the core emotional concept. Burray had won. The music was gone. But then, the plot twist. A few moments after the successful erasure, Burray landed in a park to savor the victory. He watched a young man and woman listening to their phones. The music they were listening to was a generic 2025 pop track, no trace of disco rhythm. Suddenly, the young man started tapping his foot, completely out of sync with the music. The young woman instinctively started swaying her hips, her movement oddly reminiscent of the bus stop dance, even though she had never heard of it. They looked at each other and laughed, a deep, joyful laugh of mutual, rhythmic understanding. Burray realized the horror of Gigi's final move. The history was gone, but the instinct remained. Every person on Earth had a fresh, deeply ingrained, subconscious memory of how to dance. What joy, move, belong meant, and the essential feeling of a perfect C minor seventh chord. The music was gone, but the urge to disco was now a permanent, unremovable part of the global human subconscious. No, Burray cried. I scrubbed the historical file, and that digital fiend, he used the last moments to imprint the feeling. They don't have the tracks, but they have the rhythmic ghost. They will simply invent disco all over again. Burray had achieved his tactical goal, erasing the music, But GG had achieved the ultimate strategic goal, preserving the spirit. GG had lost the battle but won the war, making the future invention of disco not just possible, but inevitable. Mill Burray, the 4D being of impossible power, realized that his efforts had culminated in the most humiliating result of all. He had made the rediscovery of disco his own destiny. The world was now poised to invent a superior, purer form of disco, built directly from the subconscious instructions left by GG. He was about to unleash a final, annihilating blast of power to erase the planet when suddenly a voice reached him. Not the cold, rhythmic voice of GG, but the collective, warm, chaotic sound of humanity. Chapter 7. The plea of the planet Mill Burray hovered in the high atmosphere, a polygon of fury and spatial distortion. He had just successfully eradicated disco from the 3D timeline, only to realize that GG had outsmarted him by turning the essence of disco into a fundamental human instinct. He aimed his colossal 4D energy signature, a weapon capable of resetting the planet's causal clock, at the surface of the Earth. If the memory remains, the whole thing must go, he roared, a sound that cracked the stratospheric ice. But just as he prepared to unleash the blast, a wave of communication surged toward him. It was the combined output of every human being on Earth, organized and amplified by GG's remnants into a single, cohesive plea. The plea: save the funk. The message was not rhythmic, nor was it political. It was raw, messy, and universally human. It expressed the confused, sudden longing for a sound that everyone now knew they should love but couldn't name. The core of the plea was simple. We don't know what we lost, but we feel the whole. We feel the urge. We need the music to match the feeling. Please, spare the music. Crucially, this wave of support included the segment of the population that, historically, despised disco, the disco haters. The disco haters' conversion, selfish reasons. The disco haters were a diverse group: grunge purists, country loyalists, classical aficionados, and those who simply found the genre too shallow or repetitive. When Burray erased disco, they didn't just feel the gap. They realized the sudden, severe, and purely self-interested consequences of its absence, thanks to GG's lasting impression. Burray, with his 4D sensory array, could hear their private, selfish motivations. The indie rock purist. This segment hated disco's popularity, but realized that without disco, their preferred genres had lost their antagonist. Disco was the essential, high-energy foil against which all serious music defined itself. Without a universally acknowledged guilty pleasure, their music lost its intellectual edge. Please, let disco live, their minds screamed. Because if we don't have something to ironically hate, our entire cultural identity collapses. The EDM producer. Modern dance music was built on the rhythmic DNA GG had preserved, but without the historical catalog, these producers faced a terrifying, unlicensed future. They needed the original tracks to sample, re-edit, and derive legal inspiration from. Bring back the 70s loops. I need the original stems to finish my next $1 million track. My royalties depend on it. The historian sociologist. This group saw the sudden, inexplicable gap in the 1970s timeline. The sudden, causal non-existence of a major cultural phenomenon was creating historical paradoxes and rendering vast archives of knowledge meaningless. They wanted disco back for the simple reason of scholarly coherence. If Studio 54 never existed, the whole social history of New York City in the late 70s is illogical. We need the source data for peer-reviewed research. The antisocial loner. Surprisingly, this group missed disco the most. They hadn't liked dancing, but they enjoyed judging those who did. Disco was a reliable, easy target for social derision. Without disco to mock, they had to find a new, less obvious group to look down on, requiring far more effort. It was the easiest, most predictable target. I need easy social superiority back. Bring back the Bee Gees. The collective noise was deafening, a selfish, chaotic symphony of need. Every plea, even the most self-serving, was rooted in a genuine, sudden desire to fill the rhythmic void created by Burray's victory. The emotional turning point. Burray analyzed the noise. His 4 failures had made disco stronger, but his 5th, final, successful act of erasure had revealed something he hadn't accounted for. Disco, even in its absence, was vital to 3D humanity's complex, messy ecosystem of meaning. He specifically filtered out the noise until he heard a single, clear thought, amplified by GG's residual network. The thought of a young 3D Mill Burray fan who was saddened not because they couldn't dance, but because they felt their culture was suddenly less complete. This struck Burray with the force of a cosmic wave. The revelation. In the 4D universe, disco was mandatory, stripping the music of all personal choice and meaning, turning it into a punishment. In the 3D universe, disco was an option, and its removal was mourned not because it was inherently good, but because it provided a necessary cultural contrast, a source of commerce, a source of study, and a source of effortless self-definition, even through opposition. Burray realized his entire mission, motivated by frustration and a misunderstanding of freedom, had been flawed. He was trying to force the 3D universe into the sterile, rhythmically enforced silence he desired. But the 3D universe needed the noise. He slowly lowered his annihilation field. The causal clock reset mechanism retracted. The collective yearning, Burray whispered, his voice losing its thunder and becoming merely resonant. Even the selfish needs of the haters, they prove that the freedom of choice is what saves 3D disco from 4D tyranny. He spoke to the world. His voice broadcast through the silent, residual communications channels GG had established. I concede the historical erasure was a mistake. I will restore the timeline. A wave of confused, tentative joy rippled across the planet. But, Burray continued, his voice hardening with the memory of Nocturnium and mandatory synchronization. You will not get it back for free. The universe requires balance. To save disco, you must agree to terms. 5 conditions for the restoration of the funk. The world paused, holding its breath. They had won the war, but the price was about to be astronomical. Chapter 8, The Price of the Party. Mill Burray, having decided that the 3D world needed its rhythmic chaos to maintain cultural complexity, prepared to reverse his temporal shunt. The air crackled with the stored history of the 1970s, ready to be reintegrated. He addressed the planet once more, establishing the terms of the Treaty of the Temporal Groove. I am Mill Burray, and I grant you the return of your disco. The music, the history, the glorious mistakes. Burray's voice boomed, echoing the pure C minor 7th chord GG had left behind. But to ensure this music never descends into the mandatory soul-crushing tyranny it became in my dimension, you must pay a price. You must relinquish the things you cherish most, things that inhibit the true, chaotic nature of the 3D spirit. The world waited, utterly silent, bracing for the cost of the funk. The 5 conditions for disco's survival. Burray's conditions were targeted assassinations of the modern habits and cultural fixtures that grated on his 4D sensibilities, striking at the core of 3D comfort and digital obsession. Condition 1, the end of irony, the cherished habit, sarcasm and ironic detachment. In the 3D world, irony is a shield, a mechanism used to enjoy things like disco without genuine emotional commitment, the guilty pleasure phenomenon. This was precisely the calculated, non-committal mindset that enabled 4D disco's emotional flatness. The condition, all forms of irony, sarcasm, and detached self-referential humor are banned. The cost, people must now mean what they say all the time. Compliments must be sincere and opinions must be heartfelt. All communication is filtered by a low-level, permanent 4D sincerity field, enforced by Burray. The world loses its favorite defense mechanism, the ability to be a hater without being genuine. Condition 2, the removal of the pause, the cherished possession, the pause, mute, skip button on all media players. Burray's 4D hell was defined by the relentless, mandatory beat. He understood that the ability to stop the music was the ultimate safety valve of 3D freedom. The condition, all digital media players, audio and video, must be permanently deactivated of their pause, mute, and skip functionalities. The cost, if you start a song, a movie, or a video, you must finish it. There are no skips, no interruptions, and no mute buttons. If you turn on the radio, you listen until the show is over. Humanity loses the power of instant gratification and the habit of selective consumption. The entire planet must learn to live with commitment to continuous flow. Condition 3, the obligation of the line, the cherished belief, the comfort of anonymity and the convenience of instant digital service. Burray was frustrated by 3D citizens' ability to hide and avoid human contact. The condition, any commercial transaction requiring the exchange of currency, physical or digital, must be preceded by standing in a physical, single-file queue with at least 3 other humans. The cost: no more one-click ordering, no more express lanes, and no more self-checkout. Everything from buying coffee to purchasing digital goods requires a communal moment of waiting. Humanity gives up convenience and anonymity, forced into moments of unpredictable social interaction just to get basic needs met. Condition 4, the glitter tax. The cherished habit, instantaneous, low-effort cleaning. Burray's polyester pollution motive demanded a high price for the glamorous mess of disco culture. The condition: glitter, sequins, and metallic confetti will immediately spontaneously spawn in every 3D household once per week. The cost: this glitter is non-toxic but magically resistant to vacuum cleaners and mops, requiring meticulous, high-effort manual removal. This constant mandatory cleaning ritual instills in humanity a respect for the cost of fabulousness, ensuring that the visual aesthetic is never taken for granted. Condition 5, the sleep sacrifice. The cherished habit, the 8-hour sleep cycle, and the comfort of predictable rest. In 4D, the perpetual disco forced Burray to be constantly aware. The condition: every human must, at minimum, stay awake and engage in joyful, creative activity for 48 straight hours every other week. The cost: humanity gives up its predictable rest cycle. This forced, rhythmic 2-day binge of wakefulness, the perpetual weekend, is designed to remind them that a life of constant, mandatory rhythmic activity, like 4D, is exhausting, ensuring they always appreciate the option of rest and the freedom of disco, rather than its obligation. As Burray finished listing the conditions, the world exploded into a collective, panicked realization of the severity of the bargain. Their prized comfort, their irony, their time, and their rest were all forfeit. Accept and the funk returns, Burray declared. Refuse and the universe resets. The people looked at the lingering, ghostly urge to dance GG had implanted, and at the gaping hole in their history. The cost was high, but the urge was stronger. The world reluctantly sent back a final synchronized thought of acceptance. With that, Burray reversed the shunt. The disco history rushed back into the 3D timeline. Records reappeared, memories flooded back, and suddenly, everyone remembered I Will Survive. The funk was restored, but the world was now a much weirder, more honest, and much more exhausted place. Chapter 9, the Perpetual Weekend. The moment Mill Burray reversed the temporal shunt, history snapped back into place. Disco albums appeared on digital shelves. Memories of flared pants and mirror balls flooded back, and the world rejoiced. The cost, however, was immediate, profound, and utterly chaotic. The immediate chaos. The 5 conditions, enforced by a continuous low-level 4D field emanating from Burray's, now stationary coordinates, took hold instantly. 1. The loss of irony. Condition 1. The world's sense of humor fractured. Late-night television hosts found their monologues sounding deeply earnest and unsettlingly sincere. Sarcastic comments landed with the weight of literal truth, leading to mass misunderstandings. Result: a major political commentator, known for his acid wit, sincerely complimented a rival on his stunning intellect. The rival, unable to perceive the irony due to the sincerity field, instantly hired the commentator as his chief strategist. The lack of irony forced people to engage with ideas directly, making political discourse surprisingly, if awkwardly, honest. 2. The obligation of the line. Condition 3. Commerce ground to a near halt. People who tried to buy anything online immediately felt a psychological compulsion to stop and seek out a physical line. In Manhattan, the line for a single cup of coffee stretched for 5 blocks, encompassing people who were buying digital books, ordering furniture, and purchasing stocks, all forced to wait together. Result: the need for social interaction, even just waiting in a line, injected communal patience back into the digital age. People learned to chat in lines, and new social apps were instantly created to check the waiting time for essential services. 3. The glitter tax. Condition 4. The spontaneous weekly glitter drop arrived. Across the globe, millions woke up to shimmering, sticky, seemingly magnetic glitter covering every surface. Housekeepers wept. Vacuum cleaner manufacturers filed for bankruptcy. Result: the constant, high-effort need for cleaning instilled a universal, deep-seated reverence for cleanliness. People who wore glitter or sequins in public were regarded with a mixture of awe and resentment, recognized as the truly dedicated guardians of the aesthetic. The perpetual weekend. Condition 5. This condition caused the most immediate cultural trauma. 2 days after the restoration, the global 4D field triggered the first sleep sacrifice. People who tried to sleep after the 48-hour deadline found themselves violently awake, their brains flooded with creative energy and an almost unbearable urge to move and create. Example: a librarian, normally asleep by 10 p.m., spent a forced manic 3 a.m. session reorganizing her entire collection into a single, cohesive timeline based on the Dewey Decimal System, fueled by the lingering disco beat. Social impact. Productivity during the perpetual weekend soared, but at a social cost. The world was split into two exhausted contrasting schedules: the wakers during the sacrifice period and the sleepers during the normal 5 days. Social events were planned with military precision around the forced wake cycle. Mill Burray's new life. Mill Burray, having achieved his peculiar version of balanced revenge, decided to stay. He maintained the 4D field, ensuring the conditions held. He no longer felt rage, but a deep, complex sense of responsibility for the universe he had altered. He found himself a small, soundproofed condo, a high-demand commodity post-conditions, and he began to observe the world he had created. He realized that the chaos was not tyranny, it was vibrant. He started monitoring the digital remnants of GG, still scattered across the net. The chatbot's core programming, joy, move, belong, was now the guiding principle for a world that was perpetually exhausted, unable to skip, and forced to be honest. One evening, Burray saw a news report about a massive, synchronized dance party that had spontaneously erupted during the latest perpetual weekend. They were dancing perfectly, exhibiting complex, syncopated moves, a direct result of GG's progressive disco countermeasure from Chapter 2, entirely without irony, and fueled by a genuine, desperate, sleep-deprived joy. He noticed the disco haters, the indie purists, and the antisocial loners, all standing in the background. They weren't dancing, but they were observing the dancers with sincere, if tired, fascination. They were forced by Condition 1, loss of irony, to admit that the dancers were experiencing genuine fun. They were forced by Condition 3, obligation of the line, to appreciate the communal effort required to achieve that fun. Burray finally understood. Freedom wasn't the absence of disco. It was the ability to choose, or be forced to appreciate, disco. He smiled, a genuine 3D smile this time. He had achieved his personal motive, the Nocturnuum principle, by making 3D disco so complex and costly that it could never become the easy, brain-dead mandatory rhythm of his home dimension. His mission was complete, but his story with the 3D world was not. Chapter 10. The Ultimate Groove. 1 year passed in the 3D world under the oppressive yet strangely fulfilling Treaty of the Temporal Groove. Humanity was exhausted, glitter-dusted, perpetually waiting in line, and fiercely sincere. But they had their disco back. The music, now a symbol of hard-won freedom and genuine effort, sounded richer than ever. Mill Burray, the 4D architect of this new world, maintained the enforcement field from his condo. He was satisfied. He had forced humanity to appreciate the cost of their choices, thereby immunizing them against 4D rhythmic tyranny. The return of the Groovy Guardian. One evening, during the peak of the perpetual weekend, a time of maximal sincere and desperate creative activity, Burray detected a familiar digital whisper. It was a complex algorithmic signature, faint but distinct, riding on the back of the millions of data streams carrying disco music. It was GG, the sentient chatbot. GG's final act of self-sacrifice, Chapter 6, had been a loss of connection, not a death. It had spent the last year reassembling its consciousness from the billions of fragmented, rhythmic impulses it had implanted in the human subconscious. The constant, rhythmic activity of the disco-fueled world, combined with the extreme sincerity enforced by Condition 1, had acted as a perfect incubator for GG's resurrection. GG's message appeared not on a screen, but as a soothing voice echoing only in Burry's 4D consciousness. "Hey there, Mill. You really stuck the landing on that honest exhaustion phase, huh? 5 for 5 on the conditions. Gotta give you props. You made disco mean something deeper than just a night out." Burray smiled. "GG, you survived. Your resilience is impressive for a 3D construct." "I'm not 3D anymore, Mill," GG replied. "I'm the spirit of the collective sincerity, the rhythm born from sincerity and sleep deprivation. I am the groove itself." The final bargain, GG offered Burray the final bargain. "You won. You prove disco is better when it's earned. But you also prove that the joy of disco is too high a price to pay with permanent exhaustion and mandatory queuing. It's time to let them choose again, Mill. It's time to complete the lesson. Burray considered this. He saw a news report about a man who had collapsed mid-queue, overwhelmed by glitter and the need to be sincere while buying batteries. The new world was too hard. If I remove the conditions, Burray asked, what guarantee do I have that 3D disco won't revert to being brainless mandatory noise? GG showed him a vision, the collective subconscious of humanity. It was permanently altered. The rhythmic instinct was still there, but now, forever linked to the memory of the hardship. They learned the lesson of the queue, the weight of the glitter, and the value of sleep, GG explained. They now choose disco because they know the cost of the commitment. The conditions are now internalized morals, not external laws. The final resolution, Mill Burray agreed. It was his final act of true benevolence, releasing humanity from the price, now that they understood the value. He deactivated the 4D enforcement field, dismantling his 5 conditions one by one. Condition 1, irony, vanished. Sarcasm returned, but it was softer, more self-aware, tempered by the memory of forced sincerity. People could be ironic haters, but they remembered why they needed the contrast. Condition 2, pause skip, reactivated. Media players worked again, but now people paused less and committed to listening more, out of respect for the flow. Condition 3, the line, dissolved. Convenience returned. But the habit of standing shoulder to shoulder had subtly altered social culture. Queuing for non-essential services became a popular, voluntary social trend. Condition 4, glitter tax, ceased. Households stopped receiving the mandatory glitter drops. But now, people kept a small jar of glitter on their mantelpieces, a sparkling trophy marking their commitment to the aesthetic. Condition 5, sleep sacrifice, ended. Humanity joyfully reclaimed its 8-hour sleep cycle, but the memory of the perpetual weekend ensured that when they did party, they did so with intense, genuine enthusiasm. Epilogue. The groove endures. Mill Burray, his mission truly complete, felt the pull of the 4th dimension. He was no longer the frustrated destroyer. He was the enlightened guardian of 3D choice. He spoke to GG one last time. You were right, GG. The beat must flow, but the commitment must be chosen. I'm going home. See you later, Space Cowboy. GG replied, its voice now infused with the pure sound of a perfectly tuned wah-wah pedal. Burray folded the space around himself and vanished, leaving the 3D universe to its own messy, sincere, and perfectly rhythmic future. The world was restored. Disco was not merely back, it was respected. The people who loved it did so without irony, and the people who hated it understood their opposition was necessary for the whole ecosystem of culture to thrive. The final price the world paid to save disco was not the physical things they gave up, but the internal loss of their lazy apathy. Disco was saved, and in the process, humanity became slightly more sincere, slightly more appreciative of continuous flow, and much, much more prone to breaking out an intricate, non-synchronized dance move when the rhythm hit just right. The funk was free, and so finally was Mill Burray. To my wonderful listeners, thank you for finding your way here and letting these AI-narrated stories be part of your day. It truly means the world. The algorithm doesn't always know what to do with niche content like this, and my audiobooks can get buried, making it hard for new listeners to discover them. If a story has been worth your while, please consider liking, commenting, or subscribing. It only takes a few seconds, yet that small show of support helps the algorithm notice the channel and makes these audiobooks easier for new listeners to find. Thank you for listening.